She spilled coffee on a stranger. She didn't know he was one of the most powerful men in biotech. He didn't expect to care. What began as an accident spiraled into something far more complicated, where ambition, reputation, and quiet longing collide behind closed doors and beneath academic spotlights. Whispers grow louder, loyalties shift, and somewhere in the shadows of science and scandal, two people must decide what's worth risking and what must be left unspoken. Want to know how it all unfolds? Subscribe to our YouTube channel now, and don't miss a story that's as sharp as it is slow-burning. This is Night Shifts and Cold Coffee. You won't see it coming. The scent of espresso hung in the air, thick and bitter, as dawn crept in through the wide front windows of the small cafe tucked beside Rittenhouse Square. It was just past 7:30 a.m., maybe, and Chloe Peterson's eyes were heavy with the weight of sleep deprivation. Her hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, scrubs wrinkled, and the name tag clipped to her chest was slightly askew. The overnight shift at the student clinic had bled straight into her shift here, where she worked mornings on weekends to afford textbooks and late-night takeout. She had just started wiping down the counter when the door chimed. A man in a charcoal suit entered, tall, sharp-featured, and looking like he'd stepped out of a Wall Street briefing. He glanced around the near-empty cafe before making his way to the counter. "Just coffee," he said, voice low but clear, with a kind of clipped precision that made her stand a little straighter. "Sure," she replied, trying to shake off the haze in her brain. She grabbed a cup, poured the brew, and turned too quickly. Her elbow caught the edge of the counter. The cup slipped from her fingers. Coffee splashed across the front of his suit, dark liquid blooming like an ink stain on the fine wool. "Oh my God," Chloe gasped, already scrambling for napkins. "I'm so sorry, I didn't my hand." The man stepped back, blinking, more surprised than angry. "It's all right," he said, a bit too calmly, as if amused by her panic. No, it's not all right," she insisted, practically throwing napkins at him in her fluster. This is dry clean only level bad. I'll pay for it. Do you want a manager? I can get the manager." He held up a hand. "Stop, it's fine, really." Chloe stopped mid-reach, cheeks flushed crimson. She stared up at him, suddenly aware of how ridiculous she must look, tired, stained with coffee herself, holding a fistful of damp napkins like a flag of surrender. "I didn't sleep," she mumbled, more to herself than him. "I mean, not for a while, clinic shift, and I have a physiology exam in like 2 hours, so, yeah." He studied her, not with irritation but a kind of quiet curiosity. "Med school." "Pre-med," she corrected. "Second year, still doing my time." A pause stretched between them. He looked down at his suit, then back at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Consider this my morning caffeine in a more direct delivery system," he said dryly. Chloe blinked, then gave a weak laugh, equal parts embarrassed and relieved. "Still, I feel terrible." "Don't," he replied, reaching for the napkins she offered. "I've survived worse." And then, just as quickly as he had entered, he nodded, turned, and left, with the bell over the door chiming softly behind him. She watched him disappear into the busy sidewalk traffic, only then realizing she never got his name. Later that morning, as Chloe rushed across campus with a lukewarm protein bar clutched in one hand and her backpack half-zipped, the coffee incident already felt like a surreal blur. She made it to her physiology exam with minutes to spare, heart pounding not just from the sprint, but from the lingering embarrassment. By evening, the cafe was forgotten entirely, until her roommate Kayla flopped onto their shared couch, phone in hand, scrolling through the university news portal. "Did you hear about that Finch biotech meeting today?" Kayla asked between bites of a protein chip. "Top secret stuff. Apparently, their CEO was on campus this morning for a closed-door session with the research dean." Chloe, curled up on the other side of the couch with flashcards in her lap, looked up. "Finch Biotech, like the gene therapy company." Yeah, the guy Alastair Finch. He's kind of a big deal. Super low profile but loaded. I heard the university trying to partner with them on some huge regenerative medicine initiative. Chloe raised an eyebrow, the name tugging at something in the back of her mind. Alastair Finch, she echoed. Kayla turned her phone around. The headline read, Finch Biotech CEO visits Penn for strategic research discussions. Below it was a blurry photo taken from across the quad. Chloe's stomach dropped. The man in the picture was unmistakable, tall, lean, with that same calm intensity. The very man she doused in coffee less than 12 hours ago. She stared at the photo. Oh no. What? Kayla frowned. I spilled coffee on him. Kayla blinked. You what? Chloe groaned and recounted the entire encounter, hands covering her face by the end of it. I didn't even know who he was. I just panicked, told him I hadn't slept, rambling like an idiot. Kayla whistled. Well, either you just sabotaged our entire medical department's funding, or, she leaned forward, teasing, you made a hell of an impression. What Chloe didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that just across the city in the back of a black town car, Alastair Finch sat reading a briefing memo he hadn't requested. His assistant had added it at the last minute, along with a single handwritten note clipped to the top. Barista, Rittenhouse Square. Possible Penn student. Unintentional coffee attack. Very apologetic. Alastair chuckled under his breath. He reread the note, his mind drifting briefly, not to the meeting, not to the board's posturing, but to the girl with tired eyes and honest panic who had offered him a dozen soggy napkins and a glimpse of real life in a day otherwise filled with polished lies. For the first time in weeks, he smiled without calculation. The grand hall of the Penn Museum was buzzing with activity, glass cases glinting under warm lights, name tags swinging from lanyards, and clusters of researchers deep in conversation beside poster boards. It was the annual Biomedical Innovation and Tech Summit, and Chloe, dressed in a Navy volunteer polo and black slacks, had been on her feet since 7:30 a.m., guiding guests, delivering water bottles, and pretending not to feel entirely out of place among the scientific elite. Just past noon, while juggling a tray of presentation kits and a clipboard, she scanned her updated schedule and froze. Her next assignment read, Finch Biotech Hall B, support booth and guest management. Her stomach did a slow, confused twist. No way, she muttered under her breath. Still, duty was duty. She made her way to Hall B, pasted on her best professional smile, and approached the tall exhibition structure with the gleaming Finch Biotech logo at its center. She recognized none of the men and women gathered there, until she did. He stood near the back of the booth mid-conversation, but even from behind, Chloe knew that posture, that suit, that quiet stillness. Her stomach twisted again. She turned to walk away, too late. Miss Peterson, isn't it? The voice stopped her in her tracks. She slowly turned back. Alastair Finch was looking at her, eyebrows slightly raised, not with mockery but faint surprise. He looked even sharper in a dark navy suit, no coffee stains this time. Chloe started, then cleared her throat, clutching her clipboard tighter. Yes, that's me. A beat passed, awkward but not uncomfortable. I didn't expect to see you here, he said evenly. Neither did I mean, I didn't expect you, she winced. Sorry, that came out weird. I'm just a student volunteer. He gave a slight smile. I assumed, but it's good to see you again without a flying cup of coffee between us. She laughed, nervously but genuinely. I promise I've improved my balance since then. One of the assistants from his team approached, offering a folder. Alastair took it without breaking eye contact. Then, with a subtle tilt of his head, he said, Would you mind helping my team get settled? They tend to scatter without a guide. Of course, Chloe replied, voice steadying. She felt her cheeks warm but forced herself into professional mode. Welcome to the summit, Mr. Finch. As she led the team through setup logistics, Chloe could feel Alistair's gaze on her now and then. Not invasive, not inappropriate, just thoughtful, curious. And in the quiet corners of her mind, between badge checks and floorplan explanations, she couldn't stop wondering if maybe, just maybe, he had remembered her too. Over the next 2 days, Chloe found herself orbiting the Finch Biotech booth more often than her duties strictly required. Sometimes she was needed, coordinating schedules, fixing a faulty projector, delivering espresso shots to bleary-eyed researchers. Other times, she simply lingered nearby, drawn by the easy rhythm that had formed between her and Alistair. Their conversations were never long, always snatched between panels or while walking from one hall to another, but each exchange seemed to chip away at the distance between them. "You stayed for the regenerative tech keynote?" he asked one afternoon, catching her outside the lecture hall. She nodded. "Of course, tissue scaffold engineering is kind of my thing, at least for now." He raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Most undergrads I meet barely know how to spell scaffold." Chloe smirked. "Most CEOs I know don't show up for panels unless they're on the agenda." "You've met multiple CEOs?" "No," she admitted, "just one so far." He chuckled, a low sound that made something shift slightly in the air between them. Later, in the quieter moments, they touched on more personal things. Standing beside a museum case full of ancient medical tools, Chloe mentioned her father, an EMT who worked night shifts and taught her how to stay calm when everything else fell apart. "I used to sit on the porch at 4 in the morning and wait for him to get home," she said softly. "That's when he was still strong enough to lift me up with one arm." Alistair listened without interrupting. He didn't offer sympathy, just silence and presence. In return, he gave her pieces of himself too. "My wife was the real scientist," he said one evening while they waited for a presentation to begin. "She hated biotech, thought it was too cold, but she was brilliant. Cancer genomics. She passed away 6 years ago." Chloe didn't flinch or fumble for comforting words. She just looked at him, eyes steady. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. They were never alone long enough for the world to ask questions. But in the narrow spaces between schedules, surrounded by glass cases and university banners, something delicate had begun to form. It wasn't flirting. It wasn't mentorship. It wasn't anything they could name. But it was there, in the way she paused when passing him a stack of notes, in the way his gaze lingered half a second too long when she wasn't looking. Alistair Finch, a man defined by composure and control, found himself wondering who Chloe Peterson really was beyond the scrubs, the schedules, and the quiet fire in her voice when she spoke about science like it was a kind of faith. And that curiosity, he realized, wasn't going away. The final evening of the conference ended with a casual mixer on the museum's terrace, string lights draped above the crowd, and the quiet hum of conversation blending with jazz from a live trio near the corner. Chloe hadn't planned on staying. She still had an online quiz due by midnight, but a last-minute volunteer schedule update had landed her with name badge check-in duties at the entrance. By the time her shift ended, the crowd had thinned just enough to feel breathable. She wandered toward the edge of the terrace, where the city lights flickered through the trees, trying to decide if she had time to grab one of the tiny desserts circulating on silver trays. "Escaped your clipboard, I see," came a familiar voice. She turned. Alistair stood beside her with a glass of sparkling water in one hand, jacket slung over his shoulder. The formality of the conference had faded from his expression. He looked almost relaxed. "Just barely," Chloe said. "I think I've met every biomedical startup founder on the East Coast today." "Then you've earned this view." She smiled and folded her arms, hugging the breeze to her. "It's nice up here. Doesn't feel like a university rooftop." "No," Alistair agreed. "Feels like somewhere people come to pretend they're not exhausted." She laughed. "That's medicine in a sentence." There was a short pause before he asked, "You always wanted to be a doctor?" Chloe hesitated, then nodded. Since I was 11, my brother broke his arm on a trampoline and I went with him to the ER. I remember watching the doctor work, how calm she was, how she didn't flinch even when he screamed. I just thought, I want to be like that. She glanced over at him, as if worried the story sounded childish. He didn't laugh. He looked at her like he was seeing her in a new light. Most people's dreams shift, yours hasn't. It can't, she said, not with what it took to get here. Chloe leaned against the stone railing, eyes fixed on the skyline. We didn't have much growing up. My mom works at a dry cleaner. My dad, before his back gave out, was an EMT. I got here on scholarships, work study, tutoring other students. Some weeks I can't even afford to sleep, but I keep going because, if I stop, everything falls apart. Alistair didn't say anything for a while. The music drifted softly behind them. Finally, he said, that kind of clarity, that kind of drive, it's rare. She glanced at him. You think? I know, he said simply. Chloe didn't quite know how to respond. There was no arrogance in his tone, no patronizing edge, just something like respect. He added, in my world, people are born with paths already paved. Some walk them well. Most forget to ask where the road leads. She looked at him. And you? He gave a small smile. I think I took the road because it looked like the only one. They stood quietly, side by side, while the city murmured below them. For a moment, it didn't matter that they came from different worlds, hers of chipped coffee mugs and anatomy flashcards, his of boardrooms and biotech patents. In that quiet space between confession and admiration, something more solid began to settle. A shared understanding that dreams weren't measured by wealth or title, but by how much of yourself you were willing to burn to make them real. The week after the conference, Chloe returned to her usual whirlwind of classes, lab reports, and late-night shifts. But her mind kept drifting, back to the terrace, to the skyline, to the strange ease she'd felt beside a man whose life should have been galaxies away from hers. One afternoon, in the library between lectures, she was scrolling through articles for a research paper when curiosity got the better of her. She typed Alistair Finch clinical trial into the search bar. The results came quickly. Finch Biotech faces scrutiny over failed neurogene trial. Ethical oversight in question after patient deaths. CEO Finch responds to allegations. Systemic failures, not individual malice. Chloe read in silence, lips pressed into a thin line. The articles were a few years old, the headlines blunt, the tone critical. The neurogene trial, a promising therapy for early-onset neurodegeneration, had been halted after adverse effects surfaced in phase II. 2 patients died. 1 lapsed into a coma. Finch Biotech had followed protocol technically, but whistleblowers had claimed early concerns were ignored. There had been no criminal charges, no official sanctions, just fallout, quiet and brutal. She closed her laptop, unsettled. That evening, she found herself walking past the hospital research building where Finch Biotech had hosted a small post-conference round table. She hadn't planned on stopping, but Alistair was standing outside alone, staring down at his phone as the last of the day's sun painted long shadows on the pavement. He looked up and noticed her. I saw the articles, she said simply, no accusation in her voice, just truth. He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. I thought you might. A pause stretched between them. Chloe didn't feel it. Finally, Alistair said, it wasn't negligence in the way people imagine. No one was experimenting in secret or bypassing protocols. But there were warning signs we didn't take seriously enough. Not because we didn't care. Because the system doesn't teach you to slow down when you're ahead. Chloe listened, arms folded. I approved pushing forward when I should have questioned harder, he continued. And when things went wrong, I was protected by lawyers, statements, and polished apologies. But none of that changed the fact that people suffered. That families suffered. He exhaled, looking past her. I think about them every day, especially when someone says I've built something great. She took a slow step forward. Why are you telling me this? Because, he said, voice quieter now, you're someone who looks people in the eye when they talk about pain. You're not afraid to sit with the ugly parts. Chloe didn't respond immediately. She looked at him, not the man in the press releases, not the billionaire CEO, but the man who had stood beside her on a rooftop and talked about lost dreams. I don't know what it's like to make decisions that cost lives, she said finally, but I do know what it's like to make mistakes and carry them alone. He gave her a long look. It wasn't just my mistake, but it was my responsibility. There was no self-pity in his tone, no defense, just honesty, quiet, sharp, and unflinching. Chloe nodded. Then maybe that's what matters most. And with that they stood in the fading light, surrounded by the silence of a truth laid bare, and not turned away. It was a Thursday evening when the invitation arrived, not through an assistant or email, but in the form of a simple, handwritten note slipped into a folded research journal Chloe had helped sort after a student seminar. Dinner, nothing official, just a break from the fluorescent lights and caffeine. Old City 7A. She stared at the note for a full minute, heart thudding somewhere between curiosity and caution. It didn't feel like a line being crossed. It felt like a question being asked quietly, with room to say no. That night she stood outside a narrow brick-front restaurant tucked along a cobbled alleyway in Old City, the kind of place you only knew existed if someone brought you there. Candles flickered in the windows. Inside it was warm, filled with soft laughter, clinking silverware, and the scent of roasted garlic. Alistair was already seated when she arrived, his blazer draped over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled neatly to the forearms. He stood when he saw her, not out of formality but out of instinct. "You found it," he said with a small smile. "Barely," Chloe replied, sliding into the seat across from him. "I think I passed the same boutique 3 times." "Good, that means you've earned the ravioli." The server brought bread, and they slipped into conversation as naturally as if they'd done it a dozen times. They talked about a recent publication in Nature, a failed gene therapy from a Boston startup, and whether artificial intelligence had any business predicting diagnoses. Chloe laughed more than she expected to. Alistair asked questions and listened, not the performative kind but the quiet kind, where the pauses meant he was considering what she said, not planning what to say next. Over dessert, lemon sorbet and espresso, they drifted briefly toward more personal waters. "You're not what I expected," she said, surprising even herself. "Cold, calculated, ruthlessly efficient," he offered, sipping his drink. She tilted her head. "I was going to say, quieter, more thoughtful, but sure, add ruthlessly efficient if you like." He chuckled, then met her gaze. "And you, Chloe Peterson, are exactly what I expected, sharp, curious, slightly defiant." She blushed but didn't look away, only slightly. "I'm being diplomatic." They smiled at each other, the moment stretching just long enough to feel the edge of something unspoken. But neither of them reached across the table, neither leaned in. There were lines unwritten, unacknowledged, but respected. She was still a student, he was still a figure of influence. They were 2 people with boundaries drawn in careful ink. When they stepped outside, the night had grown cooler. Alistair walked her to the corner where the trolley passed. "Thank you," Chloe said, "for dinner and the conversation." "Thank you," he replied, eyes thoughtful, "for accepting the invitation." As the trolley approached, she hesitated, then added, "This isn't complicated. Not yet." "I know," he said. The doors opened. She stepped on board, then turned back. He hadn't moved, just stood there, hands in pockets, watching her through the glass. She gave him a small wave. He nodded once. And the trolley pulled away into the Philadelphia night. The next morning, Chloe sat across from Kayla in their tiny apartment kitchen, nursing a too-sweet iced coffee and pretending to study enzyme kinetics. But her thoughts kept drifting, to the candlelight, to the way Alistair had listened, to the pause before he said goodnight. Kayla didn't even look up from her laptop before saying, "Okay, what's going on?" Chloe blinked. "What?" "You're stirring that coffee like it insulted your mother. Something happened." Chloe hesitated, then sighed. "I had dinner with Alistair Finch last night." Now Kayla looked up slowly. "You what?" "It wasn't a date," Chloe said quickly. "It was just dinner. He invited me. We talked, that's it." Kayla closed her laptop. "Chloe, he's a biotech CEO. You're a student. Even if it feels casual, it's not." Chloe frowned. He was respectful, genuinely. There wasn't anything inappropriate. "I'm not saying he touched a nerve," Kayla replied. "I'm saying he doesn't have to. He has power, influence, a reputation, and whether he means to or not, that changes everything." Chloe leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "So I'm not allowed to talk to someone just because he has a title?" "That's not what I'm saying." Kayla's voice softened. "You're allowed to talk to whoever you want, but be careful about what it means for you, not him." Chloe looked away, jaw tight. "It's not like I'm planning anything. I like talking to him. It's easy and rare." "I get that," Kayla said gently. "But easy doesn't mean safe, and rare doesn't mean right." The room fell quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. After a long pause, Chloe said, almost to herself, "He doesn't treat me like I'm small, or like I'm a risk, or like I'm just a girl in scrubs." Kayla reached across the table, resting a hand over Chloe. "I know, that's probably why it's dangerous." That night, alone in her room, Chloe stared at her ceiling in the dark. Kayla's words echoed, sharp and inconveniently true. It wasn't that she didn't trust Alistair, it was that she suddenly wasn't sure she could trust the space between them. The air was shifting, the lines blurring. And for the first time, she wasn't certain she knew where her footing was anymore. 2 weeks later, the news arrived like a thunderclap across campus. Finch Biotech had officially opened applications for its summer research internship, a program so selective and high-profile it bordered on mythical. 10 slots, thousands of applicants, an opportunity that could rewrite a resume and launch a career. Flyers went up overnight, group chats buzzed, professors dropped hints mid-lecture. Chloe was in her cell biology lab when Dr. Ames, stern, brilliant, and never one for flattery, called her aside. "I've recommended you," he said without preamble, "for Finch Biotech's program." Chloe blinked. "You, what?" "You've got the grades, the clinical hours, and the right kind of obsession with mitochondria," he said. "I submitted your name to the internal faculty board. You'll receive the formal application this week." She nodded, heart suddenly loud in her ears. "Thank you, I thank you." But even as she walked back to her lab station, even as her classmates whispered excitedly about the announcement, Chloe felt her stomach twist. She already knew who was leading the selection committee. That night she read the official announcement online. Finch Biotech's name was plastered across the page, sleek and corporate. Near the bottom, in smaller print, Chief Advisor and Selection Chair, Alistair Finch, CEO. She stared at the name for a long time. The next day she didn't text him, she didn't return his last message. Not coldly, just didn't. That evening her phone buzzed once, a message short and carefully worded. "You'll be brilliant with or without my presence in the process, but if you'd rather I step away, say the word. No pressure, no offense, I'll understand. A." She stared at the message, fingers hovering over the screen, heart heavy. It wasn't about favoritism. Alistair had never offered her shortcuts. He didn't even know she'd been nominated. But now, the lines between their worlds felt too sharp, too visible. The very thing she'd admired in him, his influence, his reach, had become a weight pressing into every part of her decision. She didn't reply that night. Instead, she lay awake, replaying Kayla's warning and Dr. Ames's faith and her own reflection in the dark window glass. wondering whether chasing the future she'd worked so hard for meant turning her back on something that had never quite had a name. It was raining the night Chloe saw him again. Not a downpour, just a steady drizzle that turned the sidewalks into mirrors and painted halos around the streetlights. She hadn't meant to end up near the research building, but her feet had taken her there anyway, as if her mind had finally given up trying to be rational. Alistair was waiting inside the lobby, standing by the windows, hands in the pockets of a dark overcoat. He didn't look surprised when he saw her, just tired, just quiet. They didn't speak at first. She crossed the marble floor slowly, the soft sound of her sneakers echoing between them. "I got the email," she said. "I know," he replied. A beat passed. The silence wasn't hostile, it was cautious, respectful but charged. "I don't want this to be a thing," she whispered. "I don't want people to think I'm—" She stopped herself before the word using could fall from her lips. Alistair looked at her with something like sorrow, but not shame. "Neither do I." She walked to the window, standing beside him. Outside, the rain ran in rivulets down the glass. "I miss talking to you," she admitted. "But I can't, not while this is happening. Not if I want to feel clean about it, about myself." He nodded, slow and measured. "Then we pause." She looked down, just like that. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, hesitantly, gently, and took her hand in his. It was not romantic, not possessive. It was the quiet grasp of two people who didn't want to let something fragile die before it had a chance to become real. They stood that way for a long moment, just holding hands, just feeling the presence of something unspoken but understood. And then he let go. "When it's over," he said, stepping back, "we can talk. Until then, nothing. No calls, no messages. I'll recuse myself if I need to, but you're going to make it on your own, Chloe. You already are." She didn't cry, but something behind her ribs ached as she watched him walk away down the hall, coat collar turned up, shoulders set. She pressed her palm to the glass, where his reflection had been. And then she walked out into the rain alone. The first time Chloe heard the whisper, it came from behind a lab bench during a late afternoon study session. "She's a lock for Finch," someone muttered. "Bet you anything. Wonder how close she had to get to Alistair Finch for that one." Laughter sharp, cruel, not loud but loud enough. Chloe didn't turn around. Her hand tightened around her pen. Her heart thudded like it wanted to claw its way out of her chest. By the end of the week, it wasn't just whispers. It was glances in hallways, conversations that paused when she entered a room, messages she'd sent in group chats that were left on read. The easy camaraderie of lab partners suddenly gone sterile. She knew the source before anyone said it outright. Evan McCall. Tall, confident, charming when he needed to be. Son of Dr. Stephen McCall, director of biomedical research and a close partner in Finch Biotech's academic collaborations. Evan was also one of the internship candidates, and apparently not above weaponizing envy. It started subtly. Remarks slipped into conversations about the application process. "Crazy how fast some people move up," he'd say with a smirk. "Must be nice to have private access to the selection chair." Or, "Wonder what the dress code is for backroom interviews." Some students laughed, others didn't but stayed quiet. Then came the rumor in full force, circulating in group messages, whispered in coffee lines, that Chloe had been seen having dinner with Alistair Finch, that she'd been spending time near his office, that her nomination had been encouraged by someone higher up. By the time her lab advisor pulled her aside to ask if there was anything she should disclose, Chloe felt like she was standing on quicksand. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, voice steady but quiet. "I haven't spoken to him since the process started." The advisor looked at her, sympathy flickering across her face, but also doubt. It doesn't always matter what's true. Perception shapes everything in places like this. That night Chloe sat on her apartment floor, laptop closed, the buzz of notifications from classmates rolling in like static. Kayla stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. "You want me to burn his resume?" she offered dryly. Chloe gave a hollow laugh. "I just want to breathe." "Then you keep breathing," Kayla said. "You don't explain, you don't justify, you show up, and let them choke on their own assumptions." But Chloe wasn't sure how long she could keep her head above water. Because no matter how many hours she put in, how many pages she read or presentations she perfected, the whispers now walked into every room before she did. And she knew deep down that in the cutthroat world of science, reputation was sometimes louder than merit. The official announcement came through the university's internal portal at 9 a.m. sharp. Chloe was seated in the library, headphones on, highlighter poised midair, when her phone vibrated with a flood of notifications. Alastair Finch has voluntarily withdrawn from the selection committee for the Finch Biotech Summer Research Fellowship, citing conflict of interest concerns. For a long second, Chloe just stared at the screen. Her heart dropped and her fingers went cold. Minutes later, the group chats lit up like wildfire. "Did you see?" Guess the rumors were true after all. Why else would he step down now? By noon, the gossip had grown claws. Chloe passed a group of students on the quad. One of them actually smirked when he met her eyes. A girl in the hallway coughed the word "favored" just loud enough to sting. The worst part, she couldn't say anything. She hadn't asked him to step down. She hadn't even known he would. But the timing, the optics, it all looked exactly like the story people already wanted to believe. Behind closed doors, the decision sent quiet shockwaves through the faculty and selection board. Several professors praised Alastair's graceful handling of a potential conflict. Others muttered about politics, overreactions, and caving to student gossip. Dr. McCall, predictably, was furious. "This isn't transparency," he snapped in a meeting. "This is capitulation to rumors. We're throwing away integrity over the perception of impropriety." But Alastair didn't flinch. He stood before the board, composed as ever. "I've already reviewed the early candidate rounds," he said. "If I remain involved, no matter how clean the process, someone will question it. I won't let this internship, or these students, be discredited before it even begins." It wasn't a resignation, it was a shield, and Chloe knew that. Still, it came at a cost. She hadn't spoken to him in days, hadn't seen him since that night in the rain. But now his silence felt heavier, more final. Not angry, just distant, deliberate. He had stepped aside to protect the process, and maybe, in some quiet way, to protect her. But in doing so, he had unintentionally fueled the very fire they had both tried so hard to avoid. That evening, Chloe sat alone on the dorm rooftop, wrapped in a hoodie, staring out at the city skyline. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt like a rumor made flesh, walking proof that even when you try to do everything right, someone else's story about you can become louder than your truth. And now, Alastair was gone from the process, which meant, for better or worse, everything that came next would be hers alone. The days that followed felt like walking through fog, heavy, quiet, and strangely disorienting. Chloe went to class. She showed up for labs. She answered questions in discussion sections with precision and clarity. On the outside, she looked like a student holding it all together. But inside, something had begun to fray. It wasn't just the rumors anymore. It was the silence, the looks, the subtle shift in how people treated her. A professor who once called on her with respect now passed over her raised hand. Group chats she once helped organize moved on without her. Lab partners who used to share notes now barely made eye contact. She tried to remind herself that she'd done nothing wrong, that Alastair had stepped back, that she had earned every bit of her place in the application pool. But that voice, her voice, was growing quieter against the storm of doubt being whispered around her. One afternoon, she lingered after class, waiting for Dr. Ames. He was reviewing molecular diagrams on the board and didn't look up when she cleared her throat. "Do you think I should withdraw?" she asked, her voice small but direct. That made him look up. He blinked behind his glasses. "Withdraw from the internship." She nodded slowly. "It might make things easier for everyone." He studied her for a moment, then set the marker down. "You know what I think," he said. "I think if your name were Connor or Ethan and you played squash with donors' sons, no one would be having this conversation." Chloe swallowed. "But I'm not." "No," he agreed. "You're Chloe Peterson, daughter of an EMT and a dry cleaner, which means if you walk away now, they'll all say they were right, and if you stay, they'll say you were too ambitious." She stared at the floor. "I don't know which is worse." A pause, then quieter, he added, "What do you want?" She hesitated, then, "I want to fight for it, but I'm tired of fighting alone." Dr. Ames's expression softened, just slightly. "You're not alone. It only feels that way when you're doing something brave." She didn't reply. That night in her apartment, Chloe sat on her bed with her laptop open and the cursor blinking in the withdrawal form. Her finger hovered over the touchpad, the screen glowing like a dare. She closed the laptop. She wasn't ready to quit. Not yet. The turning point came not in a boardroom or a lab, but in the student union cafe, over a cup of microwaved mac and cheese, and a Wi-Fi connection Kayla insisted was better than anywhere else on campus. Chloe had barely touched her food. Her shoulders were hunched, her hoodie drawn tight around her face like armor. Kayla, on the other hand, was typing furiously, her expression laser-focused on her laptop screen. "You're scaring me," Chloe muttered, watching her fingers fly. "What exactly are you doing?" Kayla didn't look up. "I'm following digital breadcrumbs." "Is that legal?" "It's not illegal," Kayla replied, which was not exactly comforting. For the past few days, Kayla had watched the rumors build, watched Chloe shrink further into herself, her spark dimming under the weight of other people's narratives. And somewhere along the way, something had snapped in her. So she dug into archived student server posts, into metadata from screenshots passed around on private Discord channels, into timestamps that didn't quite add up. And then she found it. A message, a fake email thread meant to look like it came from a Finch biotech assistant, suggesting that Chloe's application had been flagged under special internal recommendation. It had been screenshotted, cropped, and quietly passed around. The source: a throwaway account linked to Evan's student login, accessed from a lab terminal 3 nights earlier. Kayla leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "Well," she said, "looks like Golden Boy tried to get creative with Photoshop and forgot that the university logs literally everything." Chloe stared at her. "You're serious?" Kayla turned her laptop around, as a cardiac arrest. The fallout was swift. Kayla brought the evidence straight to Dr. Ames, who brought it to the faculty committee, who confronted Evan in a closed-door session. By the end of the day, Evan was disqualified from the internship process and placed on academic probation pending formal review. No announcement was made, of course. Universities were rarely in the business of public justice, but the silence that had followed Chloe for weeks began to shift. People started nodding at her again in hallways. A TA who'd previously gone cold offered her extra lab time. One of the quieter girls in her immunology class whispered, "I'm really glad you didn't quit." Chloe didn't gloat, she didn't post, she didn't seek revenge. Instead, she found Kayla on their apartment balcony that night, sitting under a string of warm, half-working fairy lights. "You didn't have to do all that," Chloe said softly, leaning on the railing beside her. "I know," Kayla replied, "but I wanted to. I believed you, and I should have said that sooner." Chloe didn't speak for a while. The city hummed quietly below them. Finally she said, "Thank you." Kayla shrugged. "Told you I had your back eventually." They both laughed, and in that sound was something solid, stronger than rumors, deeper than doubt. For the first time in weeks, Chloe breathed like the weight was starting to lift. The presentation room was colder than it needed to be, over-air-conditioned, overly formal, and filled with people who wore seriousness like a second skin. Chloe stood just off stage, clutching her flash drive and trying to remember how to breathe. The final round of Finch Biotech's internship selection process was a live project defense. Each shortlisted candidate had 15 minutes to present their research proposal to a panel of judges composed of scientists, faculty, and industry professionals. Alastair wasn't among them. His seat at the far end of the long table sat conspicuously empty, nameplate neatly turned face down. No explanation had been given, just absence, sharp and deliberate. Chloe Peterson, someone called from the front. She stepped into the light. The screen behind her flickered to life. Her opening slide, mitochondrial targeting in neurodegeneration, reimagining pathways for early intervention. She started speaking. Her voice was steady, but every word felt like walking a wire, tight, focused, no room for error. She anticipated the questions before they were asked. The gaps in funding, the experimental risks, the feasibility of translating mouse model success into human trials. She outlined each hurdle, acknowledged the limitations, then laid out a clear, bold proposal built on logic and hope in equal measure. Some judges scribbled notes. Others watched her with the cool, unreadable expressions of people used to seeing ambition wrapped in too much polish and not enough grit. But Chloe didn't perform, she didn't charm. She proved. With data, with insight, with a fire behind her words that came not from ambition alone but from the belief that her work, her ideas, mattered. When she finished, there was a beat of silence before the first question. One professor challenged the scalability of her model. She answered calmly, pulling up additional slides. Another asked about ethics, what she had learned from the failures of past trials. Her voice didn't waver as she spoke of consent, transparency, and patient-first principles. And then came the final question, posed by a woman from an external review board. Why you? Why this project? And why now? Chloe paused. Then, because people like my father, who gave everything to his job until his body couldn't anymore, deserve treatments that don't arrive too late. Because we spend too much time treating symptoms and not enough asking what comes before the damage. And because if we don't take risks in research, then we're just managing suffering instead of fighting to end it. She let that hang in the air. Then she gave a small nod, thanked the panel, and stepped off stage. Outside the room, she leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. Her hands were shaking, but her spine was straight. She didn't know how the judges would vote. She didn't know what whispers still lingered in the margins. But for the first time in weeks, Chloe felt something close to peace. She hadn't needed a protector, or a name, or anyone's approval. She had needed only this, her voice, her mind, and the chance to be heard. Alastair stood at the far end of the corridor, out of view from the glass-paneled presentation room. From where he was, he couldn't hear her voice, only the soft murmur of the audience, the occasional rustle of paper, and the subtle click of a remote as slides advanced. He didn't need to hear the words. He already knew what they would sound like. Calm, measured, fierce in all the right ways. A staff member passed by and glanced at him, then quickly looked away, perhaps recognizing him, perhaps unsure whether to say anything. Alastair said nothing. He remained still, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the shadows of movement beyond the frosted glass. He had read Chloe's proposal before the first round. He'd been impressed, not just by her science, but by her clarity, her restraint, her sense of purpose that didn't beg for praise. She hadn't submitted a polished pitch to impress a boardroom. She'd written a plan to change lives. But stepping away from the selection committee had been necessary. Not for optics, not even for policy. For her. Because the closer he got to her, the more he realized how much she deserved to rise on her own terms. No shadows, no unspoken debts, no need to question whether any part of her success came stamped with his name. From a distance, he watched as she stepped out of the room, shoulders square, face unreadable but proud. She didn't see him, and he didn't move. His instinct to approach, to congratulate, to offer even the smallest reassurance, ached beneath the surface. But he resisted, because whatever came next, she needed to own it completely. No interference, no echoes of him clinging to her progress. As she disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps light but purposeful, Alistair exhaled softly and turned away. He walked back through the marble corridor, out into the sharp spring air, letting the door swing closed behind him. She had stood alone in that room, and he couldn't remember the last time he had admired someone more. The results were posted on a quiet Monday morning, tucked between routine email bulletins and research center announcements. No fanfare, just a link, a list, and the unmistakable rush of adrenaline that came with clicking it. Chloe scrolled with shaking hands. There it was. Peterson, Chloe, University of Pennsylvania, accepted. She stared at the screen for a long moment, not crying, not laughing, just breathing, slow and deep like someone surfacing after being underwater too long. She had done it. Without anyone's help, without shortcuts or soft landings, through whispers, accusations, cold shoulders, and nights when she nearly gave up, she had stood her ground. Word spread fast. Professors who had kept their distance began to nod in hallways again. A few even emailed congratulations, laced with professional pride and just a hint of retrospective guilt. Then the student paper picked it up. From coffee spills to clinical research, Penn student earned spot in prestigious Finch biotech internship. It wasn't just the headline. It was the tone, admiring, inquisitive, framed not as scandal but resilience. Soon other outlets followed. Local science blogs, student-run media, even a segment on a regional radio podcast spotlighted Chloe as a rising figure in the next generation of biomedical minds. One called her the face of self-made medicine. Another titled their piece, Merit Over Noise, Chloe Peterson and the Art of Earning It. She didn't chase the attention. She still showed up to class, still worked her shifts, still double-checked every citation in her research notes. But the difference now was in the air, how people looked at her, how they listened. Even Kayla, who never gave much credit to praise, paused while scrolling one afternoon and held up her phone. "You're trending," she said flatly. "Don't let it go to your head." Chloe grinned, too late. They both laughed, and beneath it was relief, gratitude, pride. Late one night, when the noise had settled and the city had gone quiet, Chloe stood by her window, holding her acceptance letter in one hand and her mug of tea in the other. No one could see her. There were no cameras, no applause, no mentors nearby to say, "Well done." But she whispered it to herself anyway. Well done. Because she'd fought for it. And won. The auditorium shimmered with polite applause and camera flashes, the low hum of celebration settling over the rows of seats like a warm fog. At center stage, Chloe stood beneath a gleaming Finch biotech banner, holding the certificate in both hands, her name printed in bold above the line, Summer Research Fellow. She wore a simple black dress, nothing extravagant, hair pinned back, no makeup beyond a soft touch of eyeliner. Still, there was something luminous about her, something grounded and unshakably real. Behind her, a panel of faculty and company representatives smiled for the photographers. To her right, the other selected interns shifted nervously, stealing glances at their families. The event had all the trappings of institutional prestige: marble floors, catered hors d'oeuvres, a student jazz quartet murmuring through a Duke Ellington piece near the back. But Chloe's eyes weren't on the cameras. As the final round of applause died down and the MC invited everyone to mingle and celebrate, she turned her head slightly toward the back row of the auditorium, toward the seat he hadn't taken. It was empty. Her gaze lingered a moment too long, as if hoping he'd appear in the next breath. No movement, no shadow slipping in late, just the quiet, indifferent stillness of an unoccupied chair. And yet she smiled. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't longing. It was the smile of someone who knew, without proof, without a single word, that he had been watching all along. Maybe from a balcony, maybe through a live stream, maybe not at all. But it didn't matter, because she could feel it. Not his absence, but his respect. No message had come, no quiet nod from across the room, no gentle reminder of the bond they had once begun to build. He had kept his word. He had let her rise without interference, without a trace of his shadow cast across her victory. And in that silence, in that space he'd left for her to fill alone, Chloe found something she hadn't expected. Peace. She turned back to the crowd. Someone called her name. Someone else reached to shake her hand. She moved forward, heart steady, head high. He wasn't there, but she didn't need him to be. The letter arrived in late spring, on one of those rare mornings when the city felt quiet, like it had paused just long enough to exhale. Chloe found it tucked between bills and flyers in her campus mailbox, a cream envelope, thick paper, her name written in a sharp, unmistakable hand. No return address, no logo, just Chloe Peterson penned with care. She carried it upstairs slowly, unsure whether to open it right away or pretend she hadn't seen it at all. She chose the quiet of her apartment desk, the sunlight slicing clean lines across her notebooks. She sat down, ran her thumb once along the edge, then opened it. The handwriting inside was as measured as the man himself, precise, elegant, a little old-fashioned. It began without greeting. No dear Chloe, no small talk. You once told me you didn't want anything clouding the work you've earned. That silence was the fairest gift I could give. So I watched from the edge of the room, from the margins of headlines, from a respectful distance. And what I saw was exactly what I already knew, that you never needed anyone to hold the door open for you. You were always going to find your own way in. I don't write this to say I'm proud of you. That would imply your accomplishments are mine to measure, and they're not. You stood alone. You won alone. You carry that strength in a way few people do. I'm writing only to say this. If you still keep a seat for me in your life, somewhere quiet, somewhere unclaimed, I will always be waiting. Not as a promise, not as a condition, only as a possibility. Until then, stay curious, stay brave. Chloe sat still for a long time after reading it. There was no mention of feelings, no grand romantic overture, just the open door of possibility, left ajar with dignity and patience. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it back into its envelope, and placed it in the top drawer of her desk, beneath a stack of research notes and one slightly crumpled conference badge. Then she looked out the window, into the soft light of the day. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled without feeling like she was waiting for something to begin. Because some things didn't begin with declarations, they waited. Quietly, steadily. Like him. The conference hall in New York was a glass and steel colossus, all clean lines and polished surfaces that reflected the chaos of nervous presenters and huddled researchers. Chloe stood at the front of a mid-sized lecture room, her presentation slides glowing behind her, the final graph still fresh in everyone's mind. Mitochondrial pre-signaling and early cellular recovery in neurodegenerative models. The title still felt surreal beside her name, but the applause was real, reserved but sincere. She answered a few last questions, thanked the panel, and stepped down from the stage. Her badge now read Chloe Peterson, PhD candidate, University of Pennsylvania. She wore a simple gray blazer, a quiet confidence, and a new sense of ease in her skin that hadn't been there a year ago. Outside the room, the hallway buzzed with movement, colleagues congratulating each other, scholars reconnecting, cups of overpriced coffee in hand. Chloe weaved through the crowd, her notebook hugged against her chest, smiling as a junior student nervously asked for her slides. She promised to email them. Then she saw him. At the far end of the hallway, just past the last pillar, where the crowd had begun to thin, there he was. Alistair Finch. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, not stepping forward, not calling her name, just watching, still, calm, present. He looked older, but only in the way people do when they've lived another chapter. His suit was less polished than the one she remembered, his posture more relaxed, but his eyes, their steady warmth, were unchanged. Chloe stopped walking for a breath, maybe two. Their eyes met. He didn't speak, he didn't move. She smiled first. Not a performance, not a question. Just a quiet smile full of memory and maybe something like peace. He smiled back. Then slowly they began to walk toward each other, not rushed, not dramatic, just steady steps closing the space that once had been silence. And when they met, neither said a word. They didn't need to. They simply turned, side by side, and walked off into the bright noise of the afternoon, two people not chasing what had been lost, but choosing, at last, what might still be found.